My name is Mark Vernon, and I am delighted to be talking with my friend Elizabeth Oldfield. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, love. It's nice to speak to you too.
Now, look, we wondered if we could get together and try and have a discussion about Christianity, partly inevitably from the different ways that we come at what is really, of course, Christianities, but also because, particularly actually you, um, made this remark to me that you have sensed many people, maybe particularly men, who are showing renewed interest in Christianity, put it like that. And it set my mind going in a number of directions. What is this Christianity? Why? Etc. etc. And it fed nicely in a way into our kind of oblique or direct conversations over the years about what you nicely called in another conversation full strength Christianity. So look, it was to try and have some sort of discussion around that we thought we could get together.
Yeah, I certainly am pondering what feels like the winds have changed. It's a really subtle and difficult to substantiate hunch that I have that there's been a change in the spiritual atmosphere, that something in the world of ideas has shifted. And as a sort of, I'm positioned in this strange way as a kind of out Christian in lots of mainstream other conversations. I'm the kind of safe Christian, I think, for a lot of people to talk to, which is lovely. It's a huge privileged position to be in. But yes, a sense that what might have been a more naturally hostile or kind of knee-jerk rejection of the possibility of Christianity as a source of wisdom, as a kind of interesting intellectual tradition, but also kind of the potential of something metaphysically satisfying there. I'm just having lots and lots and lots of more conversations, very surprising conversations from people I would not have expected, wanting to know more. And as someone who has reflected so thoughtfully on the spiritual atmosphere in general, and who I know has been on a really interesting journey themselves, you seem like the perfect person to talk to.
So I wonder about trying to go straight for it in a way, and say for me to suggest at least as a starter for 10, what I feel as most appealing, attractive about this approach, at least one of the important things, and then just see, where that takes us. I mean, to put it sort of how I kind of can feel it, even in my more sort of vulnerable moments, I have felt a change between trying to work out for myself, what Christianity might mean, and then the broader metaphysical milieu that it's part of, which, is theistic or at least a form of idealism. To something that might be like, it's not just that I might find this satisfying worldview that somehow brings together a lot of things which I somehow feel are so crucial for we human beings, but that I might be found by an encounter with what can feel other but also most intimately real. That as well as seeking, I might be being sought. And but this is where my nerves come in too, because what feels to me like the temptation to name this approach, as say Jesus in the Christian tradition, or more broadly even God. I don't know. It feels like that almost is moving too fast, and I think it's because words like God, names like Jesus, almost as soon as I speak them, I feel all sorts of other people might lay claim to them, and all sorts of baggage is being sort of accrued around them. And yet, you know, if I was speaking to you, as it were, privately, or even if I was just speaking in my own mind, I mean, like, you know, put it like this: I have an icon of Christ, a famous icon, Christ Pantocrator from Mount Sinai, which I have in my room, and I'm in an ongoing relationship with somehow. It's a presence that speaks to me of more of my yearning, but, you know, is around me as well. So, I mean, my background is not having not been Christian and coming to Christianity, but much more born in a Christian family, you know, moved away, come back towards being unsure of, etc., all that. But I wonder whether that description, you know, makes some sense to you in some way or other.
Yeah. Thanks for going straight there. Get to the juicy
I know you like going
stuff.
straight there.
I love the G-bomb.
It's one of the reasons why I like you, so I know I can just go boom, straight in.
Straight in. Well, yeah, because I think we can talk round and round and round religion and social capital and the power of ritual and like community and all these things, none of which are bad, all of which are good and important ideas to wrestle with. But for me, this is the be all and end all. This is, you know, this is the whole ball game. Is it in our seeking? There's a lovely line in an old song by Sarah Groves which says, "I can't claim to have found the truth, but I know that it has found me." And that's, I think, what you're hinting at. The sense that what I'm feeling in the air is a lot of people, and it is predominantly men, which I would love to talk about with you why. So let's put a pin in that. But a lot of people, and I'm talking here about a particular type, actually, highly educated, lots of philosophers, lots of sciencey type minded people, artists, writers, journalists, who were kind of formed intellectually, many of them, by that first wave of new atheism, by a kind of sense of basically smart people don't do religion. That in society we are, and particularly, you know, the four horsemen of the apocalypse were all white men, right? Like high status men, intelligent intellectual men don't do religion, was the story for the last 2 decades, I'd say, easily. And what I'm seeing in a lot of those men, particularly as they hit kind of mid-30s onwards, the classic kind of David Brooks said Second Mountain stuff of, okay, I've built, I've achieved, I've kind of been very ego-led for this first season of my life. And now I'm realizing even where I have been successful there, that hasn't satisfied me at a deep level. So now I'm questing for meaning and for belonging and what is life really about. That those men are suddenly less reluctant about thinking that religion might be a place to go looking with that quest, that the kind of backwash of the new atheism is well and truly kind of ebbed now. But for lots of them, they're very safe without, it feels much safer if they don't drop the G-bomb, right? It's the intellectual tradition. It's the power of the ideas. It's, you know, we need symbols, we need myths. These things help us. They help us overcome. Again, none of which is bad. But it's very easy to come thus far and no further. And for me, the kind of edge is, and I don't know why I'm using the word edge, but the sense that past a certain point, in my seeking, is there someone seeking me? In all of these systems and very human-made worlds of ideas and texts, is there something beyond us? You know, when we first met at the RSA all those years ago, I called it the objective other, I think. You know, all these words, the divine, love beyond us, whatever you want to call it. Is there anything out there? Is there anyone out there? And that for me is so key, this sense of something personal. And, you know, that's because I'm a Christian, I'm shaped, that's my tradition, that's my experience, actually. But it's incredibly scary. And you're right that it is semantically and semiotically an absolute minefield, and all the words are like drained and tainted, and it's so tender and so raw and so vulnerable to let yourself believe in the possibility of unconditional love beyond you, for you, that I think it takes a lot of courage. And and those who are able to kind of ask that question honestly, and I hope have some kind of encounter and some sort of surrender to that, are having these very public conversions that you've talked about before, and you've talked to Martin Shaw and Paul Kingsnorth and lots of other people. But I think there's that's the tip of the iceberg of a huge number of people who've come that far and no further, because the actual, is there a God who loves me? Is there a divine presence that is good? Is the whole ball game, is the whole question. And I just want to sort of cheer on anyone with the courage to ask the question, because it sets off an emotional firestorm, and you need a lot of stability to stay in the mystery of that, I think.
So why do you think it's so emotional? I hear you partly saying it's because of our cultural times, and just the you might be embarrassed or even humiliated for wondering publicly about such a thing. I guess part of what's happened is that the new atheism has, to all intents and purposes, kind of blown itself out. And so there is this moment, maybe it's a bit of a hiatus, but it's perhaps being filled, at least by some, with the freedom, really, to not only just privately pursue, but publicly try and talk about other possibilities. And I get that cultural moment, but I even wonder, whether even words like love, they're quite hard words to use, actually, because it's so easily sentimentalized. And, the psychotherapist in me is alert to the regressive tendency there. And
tell me more what you mean by that.
So, the desire to be sort of bathed in a love that bypasses what's difficult in life. A bit like a sort of infantile dream that you don't have to grow up. And that's a deep criticism of certainly Christianity in the West. Freud put it in the sense that we long to return to a kind of state of oceanic bliss, which he actually thought was a state of mind that we perhaps first knew in the womb, even. And it's complicated, though, because there's pastoral care and the desire to be alongside people, and who doesn't, when they're really suffering, long for it to pass, and long for things to be otherwise, and feel it's unbearable.
I think there is an interesting thing in there about, and I really value that psychotherapeutic perspective, because I do think it's incredibly difficult to untangle our stories and emotions about God from our stories and emotions about our parents, right? And the safety for some of us of childhood. I was reading Dolly Alderton's book Ghost recently, and it has a beautiful bit at the end about everyone really just wanting to be 6 and be picked up in their parents' car, right? So it's better on the page. And David Baddiel in the Times this week talking about that kind of the child in all of us that longs for there to be a grown-up who is coming to get us. And it's a way that Christianity, with its emphasis on the fatherhood of God, it's a way that it's been explained away, that we long for there to be a parent, and so we have a kind of magic father in the sky who looks after us. But it feels to me like if Christianity is anything, it is at its best, and we could spend many more hours talking about it at its worst, just full-blown acknowledge lots of worst expressions of it, that at its best it parents us dare I say, God parents us in the way that helps us retain what we need to retain of our childlikeness and grow into what we need to grow into of our dignity and responsibility as adults. And it's shot through the New Testament, right? Jesus talks about, come to me, those who are little children. He is a big fan of children. He's a big fan of something about children, and that you can read that in many different ways, and theologians have. And then St. Paul talks about, it's time to grow up. It's time to move on from drinking milk. It's time to take your place. It's time to teach others. It's time to lead others. It's that like you are ready for this, that dignifying, honoring sense of calling out the capacity and the capability in someone, seeing actually that they are able to take their place in the world, and that the longing for a God who is a parent at its best, I don't think is infantilizing, but kind of tender and beautiful. But I maybe just haven't had enough therapy.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the moment in the New Testament that came to my mind was when Jesus appears first of all to Mary Magdalene on the morning of the first Easter Sunday, the first resurrection appearance, and says, "Don't touch me," and that's always super intrigues me, because it's, she's just been through this extraordinary trauma with the death of Jesus, and yet his first words to her when she sees him again is, "Don't touch me," when you would think a hug might be appropriate. And I think that is about something along the lines of what you're saying, that what I am showing you is yours to follow, is yours to know too. And Jesus then says, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. In John's Gospel, where there's been a lot about Jesus saying, "I'm going to prepare a place for you, and as I'm in the Father, so you will be in us as well." And that for me is part of this full strength Christianity, which you so wonderfully caught. Well, I don't know if you quite meant it in the same way, so maybe that's interesting. But for me, it's about catching a glimpse of a promise in Christianity, and I think it's held in other traditions in different ways, but Christianity, as it were, is my first spiritual language, so it comes to me very directly. This humanity that you have is more than you can possibly imagine, put it like that. And not only is it about being met, but can you step into that? And that excites me.
Yeah.
It kind of intrigues me. I feel I have some sense of that. One sense I have, one more thought, and then see what you're making of all this, but is that it's not primarily a moral question. And I feel this is one of the ways in which Christianity, as certainly I encounter it in churches, goes wrong. Is it makes Christianity into a sort of set of admirable and even necessary, but sort of moral ideals or demands, that part of the trouble now is that much of the Western secular world does that morality probably better often than churches, who can get very skewed up about morality, I think. But nonetheless, there is, so if it's not moral, what is it? And I think it's something about perceiving who we actually are, which maybe resonates there with what you were saying about okay, the milk was good, but look, there's more substantial foods to consume in this life as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's what is often said about the incarnation, right? That there is something about the divine becoming human that calls us to what we are almost afraid we are capable of. I'm reminded of that slightly cheesy, overquoted Marianne Williams thing about, we're not afraid that it's our glory that we're afraid of, right? It's not our lack. I have lots of thoughts about what you just said, but I kind of want to circle back, if it's okay, and ask, when you say you're afraid that in your seeking there might be someone, something seeking you, and you're afraid of naming it, what are your fears? What is the story that your mind is telling itself about what might happen, what the risks might be?
I mean, it's partly that I might be deluded.
Yeah.
You know, that is so present as a you know, even kind people might be secretly thinking, well, of course, you know, I'm glad it works for you, but you're ultimately deluded.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, it's very easy to feel that oneself, you know, slightly more broadly, and especially in a world that works on the assumption that these things aren't true, and that they're private inclinations at best. You know, we don't live in a world that assumes the cosmos is alive, let alone that it's alive with a divine presence.
Yeah.
The naming side, though, in a way, is where I feel it more keenly. I mean, the easy way for me to put it is to say it's because I feel that the side of Christianity that most directly draws me would be called the more mystical side, where you hesitate to name, really, for fear that you collapse it in the naming. But that's to hide slightly behind the word mystical. I
mean, there is a you know, noble tradition of apophatic theology, and have a lot of sympathy. My spiritual practice is increasingly silence and contemplative, kind of centering prayer, and a sense of just sitting in the love of God, and sitting kind of forehead to forehead with, I don't know, like, this is the thing you get there, it's just there's no language, completely starts to fail. And so I have a lot of sympathy for the naming fear. How much is it related to a kind of exclusivity claim of Christianity? Because that's what I'm also coming up against a lot, that the conversations I'm having with people is that they are much more willing to people who might, for, you know, 10 years have been like mainly intrigued by Buddhism, Hinduism, mindfulness as seemingly kind of less tainted spiritual traditions, are now more willing to go, maybe not least because people like the Dalai Lama are saying they should. I'm more willing to sort of look at my local produce, as it was, you know, a locally grown faith tradition. But the idea, you know, Jesus is really hard, complicated, difficult to read words about being the way, the truth, and the life. You know, how much is it if you name the presence, the more is the phrase that you love, and I love that, the more as God or Jesus, do you fear a kind of arrogant exclusivity? Do you feel cutting yourself from other forms of spiritual wisdom? Unpack that a bit for me.
mean, I certainly know that people can feel that. And then maybe also, you know, but how do you understand the resurrection? Especially when it's quite common in Christianity to insist it was a physical bodily resurrection, which because of my theology background and so on, I know it's that even that Christian is debated in the New Testament. I mean, St. Paul, when he's giving the earliest account of the resurrection, it's quite clear that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And people in theological circles sort of argue that away and say, well, he's talking about a state of being that can't inherit. But I think that it's much more plausible and actually more commodious to argue, look, even at the get-go, people were arguing about, or at least trying to discern, put it like that, what this actually meant. And for me, that is how I understand at least the seemingly exclusive phrases, is that rather than when you read Jesus saying something like, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except by me, rather than hearing it as a literal comment that you can actually straightforwardly understand, because if you take it as exclusive, you saying, I've understood completely what Jesus is saying here, thank you very much, to say, look, I don't understand what this is fully about. I do know it's the promise of life in all its fullness. And there's something about the difficulty of the statement that maybe holds me open to that promise, which in a way, I'm glad I don't fully understand, because otherwise it would just be life as it is now, but sort of a bit better. And actually, full strength Christianity for me is about discovering a whole side of life that in a way feels like it eludes me very often. But also I think when I see it, it actually makes sense of the life that I otherwise can sort of feel trapped and stuck in. Yeah. So it's really holding out for the mystery, not as in it's mystifying, but that it's more. And so again, this growing into more, can one live in that space rather than collapsing it quickly?
Yeah, I think it might be helpful just to contextualize that full strength Christianity comment, because I worry that it sounds a bit muscular Christianity, you know, that again, the language is all, there are so many unfortunate historical allusions to any of that language. And it came about in a conversation where I kind of posited this sense that British culture in particular feels a bit like it's been inoculated against Christianity by a very weak strain, which is a bit what you were talking about, this kind of moral way of seeing the world, which someone like Tom Holland would argue was distinctively and radically and revolutionarily Christian, but has been so successful in that revolution that it's now kind of so baked into our norms that it doesn't feel especially Christian anymore. And it's also, I think, the sort of beautiful / weird institutions of the crown. You know, we saw it at the Queen's funeral, this sense that Anglican Christianity is somehow one of the ingredients of the very strange cake that is Britishness, but it's really hard to taste what it is. And that kind of background noise Christianity means that the full strength version, if you like, I'm still not sure if I agree with my own usage of the term, but my experience of Christianity is that it is a very distant cousin of that weak strain, that particularly the strangeness and I sometimes think of it as kind of primary color Christianity, which is kind of Sunday school picture books, right? We know Noah's Ark, we know sometimes the feeding of the 5,000, and because it's trying to explain it for children, because of the legacy of collective worship in schools, millions of people had this kind of outline Christianity given them in primary colors, in simple songs, in RE lessons. But my experience, and the experience I think of people who are publicly converting now, is it's like comparing a primary colors children's drawing to a Rembrandt, or a Caravaggio is probably better. You know, it's like Easter egg chocolate or red wine, like really good old Bordeaux, that there is a kind of depth and richness and complexity to this story and to this tradition and to the kind of 3D, 4D experience of it that is actually really difficult to get at, because Christians, we have been so terrible at communicating it. And what gets culturally transmitted is the primary colors children's drawing. So that's kind of what, when I think about full strength Christianity, I kind of mean like Rembrandt red wine Christianity, not primary color children's drawing Christianity. And that, you know, the Caravaggio, there's dark bits, right? There's spiky bits, there's unsettling things, and the temptation is to tidy it up and make it neater and safer. But my experience in having conversations with people is they sort of don't want that. that in some ways, maybe that's part of the appeal. Does that sound familiar at all?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, it also reminds me that there are places where you can find that four-dimensional Christianity. I mean, one would be cathedrals, where it's in the stone, it can't be pinned down, and yet has that allure of richness and makes you fall silent, and you know, and they're still appealing places to people of all sorts. So it can be found actually. I mean, it's slightly harsh to say, but I have heard people say things like, it was great being in the building until someone started to speak. And so that temptation to tidy it up is a huge one, but is one to be resisted. Yeah.
I wanted to go ahead, Mark.
No, please. I was.
Well, there's two things. I'd love to come back to that question that I asked earlier about the gender aspect. And I'm very aware that the plural of anecdote is not data. And it might just be from where I'm sitting. But it also might be that women converting to Christianity midlife don't feel the need to write about it publicly, or, you know, there's all kinds of factors. But my hunch is that something is happening, especially with men. Do you see that? And if you do, any half-baked theories of why that might be?
I mean, I'm not sure about whether it's just men. There is that proviso. I mean, you know, when we were talking before, we were thinking who are the kind of antecedents to this moment, and so it's people like, on the one hand, Francis Spufford with his book Unapologetic, but then it made me think to someone like Marilyn Robinson, who's, you know, not a new convert, but is reaching people in the way that she's writing about it now.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking not so much of her fiction actually, but her non-fiction. So she's kind of come out about her Calvinism, you might say. But and then you know, one could sort of toss names around a bit. But if it maybe what it is, at least, is that people who are either thinkers or actually sort of experiencers, people who are actually perhaps more into the richness of life. So someone like Martin Shaw, you know, he's a writer and a thinker, but he's a storyteller, and he goes on these great initiation quests.
Yeah.
You know, someone like Paul Kingsnorth, who's the person you were speaking to as well. He's a writer, but he's also a storyteller, you know, and his life is very much part of his story as well. And so I wonder whether this is the moment, the cultural moment that people, because of the sense of crisis, whether it be ecological, whether it be political, you know, whether it just be the old story that growth will carry us indefinitely into a better and better material tomorrow. You know, increasing numbers of people are feeling that either there's crisis, or at least it's an empty promise that we're living by. And so, you know, it might be men, because somehow men are more attached to, or have been more attached to, that promise of the social story, and are realizing it's failing now. Something like that going on.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I wonder if, I was trying to talk about this with Jonathan Pajot, and I don't think on a Sacred episode that's not out yet, I wasn't able to fully articulate it, but I also wonder if there's something about women, yes, who weren't so swept up in that story, that the realities of care, actually the spiritual practice of care, that have disproportionately fallen to women. Often people have these metaphysical midlife crises, right, where moments where they feel their own mortality, moments of illness, near-death experiences, their parents getting old, or having their own children. These moments where we come much closer to the membrane between life and death are where we kind of, I think, force ourselves out of the stream of the everyday mundane into okay, what does this mean? What does this mean? Who do I mean? Who am I? And whether it's because of their bodies or their social roles, women have tended to live closer to that membrane anyway.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
wonder. Go ahead.
sorry, you just want to say more? Yeah.
I've got another point, but I want to hear your response.
Okay, well, so just to reflect back, I mean, we were involved a few months back with an event where Madeline Bunting was speaking, who's written a tremendous book about care. Yeah, and she very much makes that point. And perhaps the reason why it becomes a sort of spiritual or even religious question is because, as she put it so wonderfully, care involves being able to move almost instantly between something very practical, the messy business of care, if you like, or just the laborious business of care, to the soulful business of care, where you're meeting someone who's not just someone that needs a cup of tea, but who's in maybe, an existential state as well. And so the great carers are the people that can move across those dimensions of our humanity.
Yeah.
And she's very clear in her book that this lot often falls, or usually falls, to women.
Yeah. It's making me think that there's very few female transhumanists that, and this is a caricature, and I know you have more nuanced thoughts about transhumanism and good versions and bad versions, but my sense is it has at least been a kind of masculine story, homo deus, we are kind of strong enough and smart enough to overcome any challenge and become gods. And I think women have been calling bullshit on that for longer, for aforementioned reasons. And maybe that's why the failure of that story, the sense of we are more broken than we thought, and maybe it's the end of the world, is coming more strongly for at least kind of masculinized the world of ideas and the world of stories. The other thing that I'm seeing is it's quite different on the left and the right, that the people who are wanting to talk about this on the left are very strongly, have kind of strong heritage in the environmental movement very often. And that, in some ways, that's a subset of that story, right? That with our own strength, we can fix this. If we can only be our best selves, if we can only overcome the worst parts of us, we can rescue this world. And the kind of terror and grief of the enormous question mark over that now. There's often a kind of like, okay, maybe these older traditions, maybe these older stories have something to tell us. On the right, it tends to be, and I'm thinking of the sort of YouTube constellation, the son of which is Jordan Peterson. It's more like a solar system than a constellation then, if you've got a sun in the middle. But that a lot of commentators who would call themselves traditionalist or conservative with a small c, huge range in there of, wonderful ideas, and some things that I find mildly scary. But there's often a much bigger openness to religion than in those circles a few years ago. And then the kind of final point, and I'd love to hear you on this in particular, is about psychedelics. And a lot of people I know, and maybe it's just my kind of Peckham metropolitan intelligentsia life, full acknowledgement of that, but I have many, many friends for whom it's very normal to be taking psychedelics, and in and through that, moving from a kind of materialist atheist worldview to something that's much more open and interested in the spiritual. I'd love you to speak to one or any of those.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount again in what you're saying, and I'm just on the psychedelics point. I mean, my sense of that is that what actually happens with psychedelics isn't a one-way ticket to heavenly bliss, as it's often talked about, but actually is an experience you don't know what the hell to make sense of, partly because it might be very difficult, and not just even a classic bad trip, but because you feel yourself to be possessed by something that is beyond your control, beyond certainly your normal humdrum way of going about life, with its tasks and its goals and its achievements and its setbacks and whatever. So it's like, it's a bit of a whack that then makes you think, oh my goodness, you know, I've got to try and rethink everything, or re-experience even better everything, and with an openness as part of that re-experiencing. So, but then people use psychedelics in all sorts of different ways, actually. So you know, it's never just one thing. But you were saying as well before, just remind me, I've slightly lost the plot with dwelling on the
No,
psychedelic whack.
no, it's fine. Just the way that what I see is this kind of renewed openness or interest in Christianity is showing up quite differently depending on where people sit on the political spectrum.
Oh yes, yes.
And I kind of did left broadly environmentalist, right broadly traditionalist / conservative / looking for kind of structure and rigor. And then psychedelics, I think, actually is pulling people, again, particularly men, from both sides, whether it's a kind of, yeah, that I think that there are those on the right and the left, if those categories are of any use at all now, who are pursuing psychedelics initially, I think, as an alternative to religion, often a sense of kind of, this is how we integrate, this is how we heal, this is how we find freedom, you know, we need less therapy. It's an you know, it goes in the kind of meditation mindfulness box. But people surprising themselves by going, I think I'm maybe not an atheist anymore, which is interesting.
I mean, my thought right now, actually, which I hadn't quite had before, but as you say that, is I wonder whether the left-right differences tend to dissolve when people don't regard Christianity, other religious traditions, as sort of resources to draw on to continue their pursuit of how can we solve this problem. You know, whether it be more traditionally right by becoming more traditional, or on the left by, no, we need other tools that somehow, other ethical imperatives that can help us solve this problem. That can change when people realize the more submission side of this, and this is something that Paul Kingsnorth is onto, where no, actually what we've got to learn is that, back to where we started, that what we've forgotten is that there is grace, there is a wider life, and that if there's a task, it's to, first of all, ourselves understand how to give ourselves to that, and become more aligned, identified with that which is outside of our sort of modernist projects, or postmodern or meta-modern, or, you know, when these extra bits get added to the word modern, the psychotherapist in me sees this just turning around in ever decreasing circles, and still, you know, it's got to break out in something else entirely. And I think that would involve then, you know, aspects of reverence and worship, and sacrifice, and that side of what's in the tradition, but then also awakening to new ecologies, which are not just creaturely ecologies, but are, you know, the ecologies of spiritual beings and angels, and you know, which most humans for most of history have organized themselves around quite as much as their material needs. Now, you know, that's very hard to know what to make of, but it feels to me that when that starts to emerge, you certainly get a shift from, I want to use religion to booster my either leftist or rightist attempts to tackle the crisis, and move into a completely different sphere altogether. But maybe if we're beginning to draw to a close, perhaps I could put one question back to you. I mean, you know, as someone who you know, gets straightforwardly identified with this Christian tradition.
I wouldn't say straightforwardly, but yeah, there isn't
an
alternative.
I know. I get what you mean.
Nothing straightforward, Mark.
No, but it's put as if it's straightforwardly. Elizabeth the Christian.
Yeah.
Of course, it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But you know, what are you learning about what you how to offer this possibility back Or does it even feel like it has to change for you as well?
Great question. I think I'm learning how the phrase that's coming to mind is, I often used it. I used to lead a think tank called Theos, and we were talking about our kind of tone and posture in public. The phrase we tried to use was confident non-defensiveness, which is a mouthful, but that decades of feeling like Christianity was of low social status, and the assumption that Christians were stupid and also probably bigoted for some good reasons in terms of the public narrative, means that lots of people of faith are immediately kicked into a kind of fight or flight nervousness when someone is curious, because they expect hostility, and there's shame in there and fear. And that the more relaxed I am, and the more I'm like, I don't know, which applies to more and more things the older I get. And the more curious I am on what other people believe. Like, what other people believe is fascinating. And lots of people don't get the chance to actually think deeply about what they believe and why, and what they think the point of life is, and why human beings are here, and why are we precious. And that those are the best conversations, and they almost always end up in a space where you can kind of generously share where you come from without it feeling like an attack or a land grab, which is what some kind of quite old-fashioned forms of evangelism always felt like, I think. So I'm just learning that kind of stability of soul for myself, which basically involves my spiritual practices, spending a lot of time in prayer, spending a lot of time seeking to be more free and more whole and more loving and more relaxed because I'm not God, means that I can have conversations with people about it, and they're almost always really fruitful and lovely and interesting. But when I feel myself getting prickly and defensive, as if it's mine to defend, I should defend the good name, it just goes pear-shaped, because that's not a space where anyone is able to drop into the reflective mode, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think about what is in some circles called dialogos now.
I don't know that word.
Formerly known as dialogue, is
it's so pretentious.
But it's essentially, I do see why there's the desire to put it in a slightly different inflection, because it's the move from a kind of two-dimensional, I'm going to get you, no, I'm going to get back, kind of, to, can we together in our conversation be open to the more than we both know, but there's something about what we can bring to that encounter that is essential too. And so maybe, you know, that the undefendedness you're talking about there is wanting to bring all that is, you know, so valued, but with a kind of humility, that part of what I value is that it means more than I can know as well, and that, and God is in all places and people, and so why shouldn't I listen out for it in all places and people, you know, something like that anyway.
My husband Chris, who you know, often says he's trying to take God seriously and not take himself seriously, and that really helps me.
Hey, look, maybe that's a point to draw to a close, unless there was anything else you just wanted to add in.
That feels like it's been a rich conversation.
Well, look, to anyone still listening, you know, please put thoughts and comments in this spirit, perhaps, of wanting to engage with these things, realizing maybe the need, but also the allure of these things, these kind of conversations. And Elizabeth, maybe as it settles in us, we will try again and see where it takes us in another
lovely encounter. Please do get in touch on Twitter or via Mark. I really love chatting to people about this stuff.
yeah, we're both around on social media and elsewhere. So
hopelessly addicted.
Thank you as ever, because one of the things I love about talking to you about these things, there is this spaciousness, this commodiousness, and so it's been good to talk.
It's been lovely to talk to you too, Mark.